Okay. So today is July 16, 2021. I'm Christy Lin, an intern with the Houston Asian American Archives. And today I'm having the privilege of interviewing Dr. Phoebe Zhang. So thank you for joining me today. And to start off, I guess um, I want to ask, where and when were you born? If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I was born in Fuzhou on mainland China in 1983.
Could you describe the neighborhood that you lived in, and if your family moved around uh, while you were living in China?
Yeah, we lived with my maternal grandmother, but I also spent a lot of time at my other grandparents' house. So we had both sides. My dad has five brothers and sisters, and my mom has three older sisters, and so had a lot of cousins on both sides that were around my age. So we were always over at the grandparents' houses playing.
That's nice. So you spend a lot of time with your extended family.
Right.
And could I ask, do you have any siblings?
Nope, just me.
How was that like growing up as an only child?
Well, it was pretty normal in China. All of the cousins that I had and all of my classmates my age were only children. I did have some older cousins that had siblings, so I didn't know that it was that different. We had plenty of neighborhood kids and cousins to play with, so it didn't feel like we grew up alone or anything.
Yeah, that's nice.
Um,
Mhm. And also, um, what kind of family gatherings did you have, if any? Like, did you do anything big for holidays, or what holidays did you celebrate?
Yeah, so we would get together probably almost every weekend at the grandparents' house. So I remember a lot of meals there. Um, my grandfather was really into mahjong and like had this like permanent space in the house that was basically dedicated to playing mahjong, and like people from all over the neighborhood would come and play. Um, and in terms of holidays, we basically celebrated, I guess, the normal Chinese holidays like 中秋节and the New Year, and so I would say that um, I guess for a Chinese upbringing, it seems pretty typical. Fuzhou
Oh, I'm sorry, you froze up.
smaller city. In, can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, you just froze up earlier when you were talking about Fuzhou.
Yeah. So I was saying Fuzhou is a small city in China, but even the small cities in China are quite densely populated. Um, and I would say that during the period of time that I lived in China, it was still not as densely populated as it is now. Like there weren't as many high-rise apartment buildings, and it was mostly one and two-story homes. Um, and that's changed dramatically now because now you can't find any one or two-story homes hardly ever in Fuzhou.
And could you perhaps talk about some of the memories that you had as a child? Is there any particular meal or games or hobbies that you remember enjoying back then?
Yeah, so Fuzhou is a city that is close to the ocean, and so it's very heavy on seafood. And Fuzhou is also just across the strait from Taiwan, and so there are a lot of common foods. So I think one would probably be the fish ball, like really into fish balls. And whenever we go home to visit China, that's one of the first things we get.
Um, and did you, as a child, did you have an idea of like what you wanted to be when you grew up? Like, did you have something that you would consider a dream job?
Um, no, I wouldn't say that I had something specific in mind. My dad was a high school teacher, and my mom worked in a medical research lab. Um, but I wouldn't say that there was a specific occupation that I was really interested in at the time.
Speaking of that, did your parents ever try to influence you about your like future career, or did they, I guess, try to motivate you to become, say, like a teacher, like your dad, or anything like that?
Um, no, not specifically. I would say that my mom was actually hoping that I wasn't going to become a training pathway is so long in the United States for that. Um, but in terms of a specific career, I don't think they encouraged me to do one thing or the other.
And the last question for this section, would you say, what were some of the values that your parents emphasized in your upbringing, that you really remember?
Definitely persistence and hard work. I would say that my dad, because he was a math teacher, he really emphasized the importance of being great at math. And even in the summertime, like even after we moved to the United States, when like most kids are just at camp or playing during the summertime, I would have to spend an hour every day doing math problems. And that actually ended up opening a lot of doors for me. Um, so um, because my math skills were relatively advanced, I was able to skip several grades, and I actually started college when I was 15 and all great at math.
Great. That actually transitions nicely into the next section. Could you tell me when your family immigrated to the United States?
Yeah, so my dad actually moved a year before us. He moved in 1989. And then my mom and I came over a year later. My dad was enrolled in the master's program for American literature at Sonoma State University in California. And then my mom and I came in 1990 after he'd gotten a little bit more settled.
And how old were you at the time?
I was 6.
So you spent, or you were enrolled in middle school and high school here?
Yeah,
Um,
so I actually started off in elementary school when I came, and then and then I've been here since.
as a child, did you feel, immigrating here, did it feel like a big Did it feel like a big culture shock, or did you not really notice any big differences?
Yeah, there were a lot of big differences. So I will say that like, one of the things I noticed the living situation in the United States was a lot better in terms of like the average infrastructure of a house. So I remember when we were growing up in China, like at the time that we left, our bathroom was actually like outside of our house, and like so if you needed to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you actually had to like leave your house. Um, and then even like just showering was very different, or bathing was very different, right? Like in China, we didn't really have hot water at the time. And so if you wanted to take a bath, what you would do is you would take like you would get a giant metal tub, and then you would fill it up with hot water, and then you would take a bath that way. And so like this whole concept of like running hot water was quite different to me.
Yeah, that must have been a big change. um, also,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, and then also, okay, so
Mhm.
also the other thing that was very was the variety, different types of ice cream. And so, like, one of the first places we went to when we came to the United States was Baskin Robbins. And I was really shocked at how many different types of ice cream there were, because basically, when we grew up in China, there was really only one type of ice cream. It was like some generic vanilla ice cream. You could only buy one type of cake, which was a white cake with white frosting and red writing on it. And so it was really surprising to me when you came to the United States and like there's just all this different variety. And although now in China, it's like the opposite, right? Like, so if you go to China, like the variety is endless now. But back then, when we came over in the late 90s or late 80s and early 90s, there was really quite a limited selection of things along the entire product spectrum in China.
Would you say because of the variety, did you feel that your tastes or the kinds of food that you liked changed?
Um, I would say that I definitely of different types of food. But there are some things that still kind of stay the same. Like I really prefer an Asian style of cake that's very light and where the sugar content is not as high. Um, but in terms of like the variety of foods, I now I pretty much eat everything. So
And since you live with your parents, did one of your parents cook, and what kinds of food did they cook? And did that also change when you moved here? Did they start cooking different kinds of dishes, perhaps American?
When I lived in China, we lived with my grandmother, so she actually did most of the cooking. And then when we came to the United States, my parents took turns cooking, um, and all of the dishes that they cooked were pretty much still Chinese dishes. And so there was a lot of like 番茄炒蛋, like we still eat that today. So I would say that the vast majority of the food I ate growing up was still Chinese food.
Great. I also wanted to ask, with your family, did you speak Mandarin, and where and when did you learn English or begin to learn English?
Yeah, so we spoke mostly Mandarin at home, and then obviously when I was in school, we spoke English.
Okay, so you only started learning English when you moved here?
Um, for the most part, yeah, my dad had taught me just a couple of simple phrases and like nouns in English when I was still in China, but for the most part, I learned almost all of my English in the United States.
Oh, that's amazing. I wanted to ask also later, so you did mention that you matriculated early as a 15-year-old, was it, to UC Berkeley? I wanted to ask how you prepared, like leading up to that. You mentioned also that you skipped grades, but I was wondering like how was it your relationship with the public education system leading up to the moment that you wanted um, to go to UC Berkeley? And sorry, also, um, like, was it your decision about going to college early, or was it kind of your parents pressured you a little bit about that?
Oh, so I feel like the progression happened very naturally. So when I was in first grade, again, because of the math skills, we sort of spent time in both first grade and second grade throughout the school year, and so it was kind of nice because the two classrooms were just connected. And so during certain periods of time, like when we were studying more of the math and science parts, I would just go back and forth between the two classrooms. And so then when it came in time for third grade, I just enrolled in third grade. And then the summer after fifth grade, I took a class. I took an algebra class at the local high school for summer school. And so when it came time to enroll in the next grade, we actually ended up just going to seventh grade. And then that's sort of set up this problem where the middle school didn't have any of the math classes that were sort of next in the progression. And so I ended up having to take math classes at the high school while I was in middle school. And so it was kind of a problem for my mother because I couldn't drive at the time. So she ended up having to drop me off in the morning at the high school and then picking me up halfway through the day and then dropping me off at middle school. And the way the scheduling worked out was that the math class that I needed to take was only offered during second period. And so they let me take an English class during the first period. And so then I ended up taking 2 periods at the high school, and then the rest of the day was at the middle school. And so by the time that I got to ninth grade, I had already some additional high school credits. And I continued to take more advanced math classes during the summertime at the local community college. And so by the time 3 years of high school had rolled around, I had enough credits to graduate. So we just decided to graduate.
Yeah, that's amazing. I wanted to ask, um, I mean, I know that it was, as you said, a natural progression, but if you could go back in time, would you have decided to enter college as early as you did? Because um, I don't know if you felt maybe less emotionally prepared, and when you went to college, maybe could you describe your experience there as someone younger than like the average freshman student?
Yeah, it didn't. I didn't personally feel very out of place because again, it wasn't like the 3 grades had been skipped all at once. So I had always felt like I was in my peer group, and so going to college just felt like the natural progression. Um, Even though the obviously the people are different. Um, so I didn't feel like there was a huge difference. And if people didn't ask you about your age, they didn't really know that you were younger anyway. So it didn't seem like it was a huge issue.
And if they did find out like you were younger, did that ever change their perception of your like their attitudes toward you?
No.
Yeah, that's good to know. I also want to know how you came to decide to go to UC Berkeley?
Yeah, so that was kind of an easy decision for us. I obviously applied to a lot of schools in California, and because I was younger, my parents were really hoping that I was going to stay closer to home, and so that was sort of an easy choice because Berkeley was 30 minutes away, and it was like far away enough that you could have some independence, but not so far away that your parents couldn't come bail you out of some situation if they needed to.
And where did you live while attending UC Berkeley?
Yeah, so my first 2 years I lived in the dorms, and then my third and fourth year I lived with some friends on in off-campus housing.
And did you go into college already set on a major, or did that kind of happen over time?
Yeah, that definitely happened over time. So when I first started, I really wanted to be a computer science major or electrical engineer. And so I had actually started off taking several computer science and math classes, and then eventually switched over to molecular and cell biology.
Was there a particular class or a moment that kind of spurred you on in that direction?
Um, we had a human anatomy class that was in integrative biology, and the professor was very dynamic. Her name is Marion Diamond, and she's a little bit eccentric. Like she'd carry a brain in a hat box around um, for her class, and so that sort of turned me on to anatomy, and she like was very old school in the way she gave her didactics. So she never had any slides. She never had any, like, I don't know, you're probably too young for this. You don't know what a transparency is, but like, we used to have these things called projectors, and a transparency is like a clear piece of plastic that people would write things on, and then it would be projected onto a screen. Um, but like she would actually do her whole talk with just chalk and a chalkboard, and she would just draw everything. Um, so it was kind of a very old school way of teaching. But that was probably my one of my favorite classes in college, and then and sort of steered me more towards biology after that.
And could you talk about maybe the social life at college? Did you make a lot of friends, and like, did you attend a lot of the social gatherings or social events they had?
Yeah, yeah, I definitely participated in a lot of community service activities. And then I was very close with my dorm mates on my floor. And I do remember that like in college was the first time I had a boba drink, and that was like kind of life changing. And ever since I've been addicted to boba.
That's really funny. um, Also, could you perhaps talk about going back a little bit, like what expectations that you had for university, and did it really compare with your experience of it?
Uh, My first year was kind of difficult academically because all through high school and middle school, things had just been really easy for me, right? And when you get to college, like nobody is regulating your time, right? Like you're responsible for your own time management, and the classes are a lot harder. So that was kind of a big challenge for me. I came from a relatively small town. My high school had about 300 people. And then like Berkeley was just a huge setting where like there would be like classes I had that had 300 people, right? Like just a single class that had 300 people. So it was very different. And basically like everybody is just as smart as you are. And so it was a very different environment. And I felt that I, it was, it was a challenge because I like now I actually had to put in effort, right? Like I actually had to like figure out a schedule and actually dedicate a lot of time to understanding concepts. So that was a big change for me.
Did you ever get to a point where, did you eventually become more comfortable with managing your own schedule? And like, how did that look? Or like, I guess, how long would you say that took? Or like, how did you try to overcome those challenges?
Yeah, so it probably took me about a year to really get into shape. And one of the things that I did was like pretty extreme. So I would get like a planner and I would actually like plan out my entire day in like really finite increments. Like I would even schedule in things like catch up time or like this is when I'm going to take a shower. And like it was very detailed and very specific. And then um, and but it worked, right? Like it's like if you follow the schedule, you've sort of allocated the time according to your priorities, and then you'll get what you need to get done.
Did you keep any of these habits growing up now, or um, did you kind of did you stop being maybe that extreme in your planning, or is that something that you've kept even now as an adult?
Yeah, definitely don't do that now as an adult. I definitely still did that when I was in medical school, but definitely not now as an adult.
Great. Could you maybe describe the demographics at your university and more specifically, like um, with like STEM students in that department?
Yeah, I came from a high school that was predominantly Caucasian. There were maybe just a handful of Asians in my school. And then when I got to Berkeley, like they were actually the majority of people, which was quite different for me. Um, and then in terms of um, the proportion of people in STEM classes, I guess it I'm not sure how to describe that exactly because basically even in the humanities classes there were a lot of Asian people, so they um, I just like had never seen that many Asian people before outside of China, like being in China.
So you never felt out of place or anything? And did you ever, or do you still keep in contact with some of the people that you met then? Um,
Oh yeah. So I have two friends from college that I still talk to probably every other week. And then my roommates from college, I talk to probably more intermittently. They both still live in California. So sometimes when I'm back in the Bay Area or in San Diego, I'll go visit them.
oh, that's great. Um, and to close this section, what was the most enjoyable aspect of being a college student for you? And what were some fond memories that you recall from back then?
Yeah, I would say that that's probably the time where I really learned to enjoy food from other cultures. Like that's probably the first time that I had Thai food, that I had Indian food, um, and, and and that I had like significant amounts of like regional Italian food. Um, because prior to that, again, like my parents and I, we didn't eat out very much, and so we mostly ate Chinese food. So so that was sort of a big eye opener for me.
Oh, was this because of the selection that they had at like a cafeteria on campus, or is it because of the food scene in Berkeley?
The food scene in Berkeley.
Yeah, that's great. Um, I so moving on, I wanted to speak with you about the surgical residency and the fellowship that you went through. Why did you decide on Houston Methodist as a hospital for your residency training?
Yeah, mostly for two reasons. I had met two people during my interviews who I really liked and who I thought would be good mentors for me. One was Rob Todd, who's now the chief of trauma surgery at Emory at Grady Hospital. And he was the associate program director at the time. And then the other person was Barbara Bass, who was the chair of surgery at the time. And I just during my interviews, I really connected with them. And so I felt like they would be good mentors and sponsors for life, which really has happened because they've actually both moved on to different institutions. And, but I'm still in contact with them and I still call them for advice. And that was exactly the thing that I was looking for when I was looking for a program.
Great. And could you describe what the residency training entails? How long did this period take, and perhaps how were you graded or assessed?
Yeah. There are So general surgery residency, the clinical portion is 5 years or 60 months. And a lot of programs have optional, what is called, sometimes optional, sometimes required, what's called personal development time. And generally this is a time taken between years 2 and 3 or 3 and 4, where residents do either basic science research or clinical research, although in more recent years, it's really expanded. So now people do education research and get a master's in education, or in my case, I went to business school and got my MBA. Some people get an MPH during that time. Some people do device development. So it's very different now what people can do during that time. So I took a pause in the middle of residency after year 2. I went to Duke and got my MBA. I was in the health sector management program, and I had a lot of interesting experiences during that time. My summers were spent doing different types of internships, which is what all MBA students do. And so my internships were at Duke University Hospital in the performance improvement benchmarking section. And I also spent some time at a company called Intuitive Surgical, and they make the Da Vinci surgical robot. And I have sort of decided within the past couple of months to a year to sort of pivot my career more towards that direction. And so that time was really foundational for me. I had a couple of classmates during that period of time who started a small company with me to make serious games. And so my partner was a programmer for EA Sports, and so he had worked on the Madden football series, and he was interested in this idea of serious gaming, which meant that we were going to use games to teach people skills and to promote knowledge transfer. And so he had already built a game for the University of Florida on burn resuscitation principles. And so we formed this company, and we only had one product, which we sold to the Duke Clinical Research Institute, which was a product on teaching medical students how to negotiate. And but because I had that role, I was hired by Intuitive Surgical to work on their surgical skills simulator. And so I was hired for a summer to gamify their simulator. And then I returned the next summer to work on a different game, which was to teach OR staff principles of efficient robotic OR turnover efficiency, robotic OR turnover efficiency. And so, and I've always kept in contact with those folks over the years, and the people that were in my research group at the time. And so more recently, I started talking to them again, and then actually in the fall, I'm going to be taking a position there as the medical director of global access, value, and evidence.
Well, that's incredible. You've had a wide range of experiences. I going back. Sorry, I didn't ask this earlier, but what made you decide to become a surgeon or to, um, begin your surgical residency? You did mention that you changed your major in college. So how did you become set on becoming a surgeon?
Yeah, so when I started when I started medical school, I didn't think that I would want to do surgery. Um, I in my preclinical years, the things that I really liked were neurobiology and neurology. So I really thought that I was either going to be a neurologist or a pathologist. But when I got on my clinical rotations, I found that I really enjoyed surgery because of the immediacy of the effect. And this is sort of related to the surgical personality in some way, in that like surgeons are not very patient people, and they like seeing the effects of their work right away. And so that sort of instant gratification was sort of what drew me to surgery.
Yeah, that's great. Um, and since you lived in Houston for quite a bit, where did you live, like specifically, and what was your first impression of the city? Like, did you like it?
Yeah, so I've lived in Houston on and off since 2008. When I first moved to Houston, I actually lived in Pearland. I had a Siberian Husky at the time, so I really needed a place with a yard, with a big yard. And so that's where I ended up living my first 2 years. And then eventually it just got like too hot and too miserable in the summertime for him. So he ended up back in California with my parents. But I still had the house in Pearland. And then I went away for 2 years to Durham. And then when I came back, I really didn't need that house in Pearland anymore because I didn't have the dog anymore. So I sold the house in Pearland, and then I moved to Rice Village. It was nice just because it was a lot closer to the hospital. It was a lot more convenient. There were a lot more restaurants nearby that I could walk to. So I lived there for about a year and a half, and then I met my future husband, and then eventually we got married, and then I moved to the Heights.
Oh, that's nice. Speaking of, did you visit your family or your parents in California often during this time, um, or or like how did you keep up like meeting them for like maybe holidays or anything like that?
Yeah, so the the residency situation is kind of tough because like there is a finite amount of time you can take off. It's not like when you're in school where you automatically have certain holidays off, right? In residency, you basically have to take turns covering the holidays so that not everybody can be off during the holidays because the hospital runs all the time. And so during the holidays, we had a system where basically you would either get the week of Christmas off or you would get the week of New Year's off, but you couldn't have both times off. And so all the other holidays were kind of like that too. So I didn't get to see my parents every holiday, but some holidays I would go back to California. Um, my mom did come visit me every once in a while. My dad never came to visit me. Like when I was like, even when I was in Durham for 2 years, I think he only came for graduation. And then the entire time I lived in Houston, he came once again for graduation, for my residency graduation. But my mom actually came to visit me quite frequently. And then also during residency, every once in a while, you would present papers at conferences. And so if I had a conference that I was going to, sometimes my mom would actually meet up with me there, and then we would be able to spend some time together that way.
That sounds lovely. But it must have been difficult to celebrate like Chinese holidays, or even more so, with the very limited amount of time you had off. Um, to go back to when you started that business with your friends, could you talk a little bit about the process there? I mean, it seems like a very big endeavor.
Oh, actually, well, it wasn't that difficult because like everybody took a separate little piece of it, and so we basically registered it as an LLC in Delaware, and then there were classmates of mine in the group who were responsible for working on the marketing piece, and then obviously I was in the content development part. One of my partners was in the programming portion. And so it actually wasn't bad. It wasn't a huge company. Like it was really just like the four of us. And we only had one product. So it actually was not that complicated at all.
Could you talk about like how so you with this one product, how did you like begin getting it out there and kind of um like maybe the kind of excitement that you felt like seeing your product being in use?
Oh, yeah. So we actually just handed it off to the Duke Clinical Research Institute. So we actually never saw the product evaluation afterwards. And I would say that that is kind of one of the frustrating parts about product development is that you may or may not ever see it actually in the hands of somebody that you developed it for. So very similarly, the game that I helped develop at Intuitive Surgical, we actually made the game, but it actually never got distributed. Um, so to answer your question, like I've never actually seen the product in someone's hands.
So I guess that's also the appeal of surgery as well, as you mentioned, like being
Right,
free.
exactly.
um, and I saw that you later completed your or actually going back, did you ever was there a particular person that you kind of looked up to while you at Houston Methodist that you would consider like a mentor, or and if so, like what is the most like memorable advice or kind of lesson that you learned in during that time?
So I would say again that that person is probably Barbara Bass, and the best advice that she gave to me was that it's fine that people's priorities change over time. And so when I became a resident, and even now, like the sort of the dropout rate for general surgery is about 20%, which is like a lot, right? Like um, to lose 20% of your classmates along the way is a lot. And so that used to really bother me. And I used to think like, well, why can't we hang on to these people or like support these people enough that enabled them to finish residency, right? And so basically she told me that, you know, 5 to 7 to 8 years is a long time, especially in your 20s and 30s. And it's totally fine that you mature and your priorities change, and that surgery is not for everyone, and that's okay, right? Like you reach a period of time in your life where you weigh what you still have to complete in terms of the sacrifice to finish residency versus your family or the other priorities in your life, and you just make a decision that's best for you and your family, and that's totally okay.
But did you ever feel that way as well? Like perhaps your priority, some of your priorities changed, or um, it was a difficult time for you? And like, how did you keep motivating yourself to keep going on this path?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate in that I had a really supportive family in the sense that even though my mom was not super excited about the surgery thing, like she was still really supportive in terms of helping me with like if I ever had a really hard rotation, like she would actually just fly here and help me do like the day-to-day life stuff. Like she would help me like do run my errands or like go to grocery shopping or like and so that was really helpful. And then similarly, when I got married, that probably like offloaded so much of my day-to-day stuff that I could really focus on my job. So in that sense, like my husband has been really great as a partner because um, I guess we don't really fit that stereotypical role the where the wife handles sort of all the household things. Like we have a very equal division of labor in terms of both childcare and sort of running the house, running the errands, doing the bills. And so that has actually been really good for my career, and really has reduced the amount of stress in my life.
That's so wonderful to hear that everyone around you has been very supportive and caring during this time. Um, and I saw that you worked to establish like a general surgery leadership and healthcare administration track program while as a resident during your residency. Could you maybe talk about the difficulties that went and like how you went about establishing this program?
Yeah, so um, when I was getting my MBA, my chair and we really talked about how to actually put those skills to use. And so I think that's one of the challenges of people who get an MBA when they're a medical student, right? Like you really need an opportunity to actually to continue to use some of those skills, but then like you go into residency for 3 to 5 years, and how are you actually supposed to use those skills? Um, so one of the things that Methodist had, and many hospitals have, is an administrative residency or administrative fellowship. And typically they're geared for non-clinical administrators. So like people who have completed an MBA, or have completed a MHA and they want to become hospital administrators. And so typically they'll either do an internship or they'll do this type of fellowship at the hospital where you gain practical experience by doing projects and by working under the different directors and VPs of different service lines. And so we felt that that was really important to do to gain sort of this practical experience. And so what we did was we applied for a exemption from the American Board of Surgery to extend my training by a year. And that year we actually folded into the remaining 3 years or 36 months of clinical training. So we extended it out to 48, but it would be alternating so that you'd spend like 3 months doing a clinical rotation and then you'd spend 1 or 2 months doing an administrative rotation, and we just flipped this back and forth. It was a lot of coordination on the part of the hospital and on the part of the residency to make it work, but it worked out really well.
That's amazing and definitely helpful as well. And you later completed your fellowship at UCLA. Why did you choose UCLA?
Yeah, I had a very specific goal in mind when I was choosing the fellowship. I was planning to return to Methodist and build an endocrine surgery program. And so before I left, Methodist had never, before I left Methodist for fellowship, we had never had a endocrine surgeon before. We had obviously had people that did endocrine surgery. And so they either were surgeon trained or general surgery trained or ENT trained, and they sort of developed a focus in this area, but nobody had been specifically trained for this area. And so I knew that I would have to sort of build a program from scratch. And when you build the program, it's not just about the surgery part, but it's about integration with your medical endocrinologists and your thyroid pathologists and your nuclear medicine folks and your neuroradiologists. And so I really needed to understand how those components came together, and also how to build not just the practice, but the entire environment around endocrine surgery. So of the programs, UCLA was actually a relatively young program. I was their third fellow. And the endocrine surgery program there was actually relatively young. I think it had been around when I was there. It was like the 8th or 9th year it had been around. And so the program director had actually built it from scratch, like, because prior to his arrival, endocrine surgery did not exist there. And so, so I knew I had a lot to learn from him in terms of how to make it successful and how to grow the practice quickly. And so that's why I chose to go there.
Wow, that's wonderful. And so you moved back to California during this time. So I'm assuming that maybe you met up with your family a bit more, or were you too busy that you still weren't able to meet up with them?
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely met up with my mom more because she was living with us at the time. So when I was a 5th-year resident, I actually had my first child. And so my mom actually moved in with us right when I had my first child. And then I was really lucky in that when we moved to LA, both my husband and my mom moved out there with our baby. And my husband was able to work remotely for a year.
Yeah, you mentioned, yeah, that you met your husband, but so during this time, could you elaborate on like when and where you met your husband first and how that relationship got started?
Yeah, I actually met my husband online, and we met up at Empire Cafe. Um, and that was our first date. And then we just went on a bunch of more dates after that. And um, I would say, like, of the relationships I've been in, it just felt really easy. And he's been a great partner this whole time.
And sorry if I missed this, but was this during the residency period?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh wow, how did you juggle, I guess, dating and continuing your work?
Yeah, it is definitely kind of challenging dating as a resident because you work really long hours, but it requires just a lot of extra planning. I mean, you always know like which days you're going to get off. There just aren't that many. Like you get about 4 days off a month. And so you just have to plan a lot ahead of time.
And what does your husband do for a living?
Yeah, so he works in the tech industry. And so that's been really convenient for us in terms of flexibility, in terms of working from home or working remotely. So that's been great.
And did he live in Houston during this time?
Yeah, so my husband is was born and raised in Houston, and the only time he's lived outside of Houston is for a brief period of time when he lived in Sweden for a internship, and then when I dragged him to California for the endocrine surgery fellowship.
And when did you two get married?
We got married in 2014.
Wow. And when did you have your first child?
We had Zoe in 2016 during my chief year.
Oh, what's your chief year?
Oh, that's your fifth year or your final year of general surgery training.
Oh, I see. How did you manage taking care of your child and completing your training? You did mention that your mother came to stay with you, so I'm guessing she helped a lot on that part.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's really crazy when I think about it. Um, so during residency, um, we had a couple of people that had kids during residency. Most of them were male, and so their spouses usually took care of the children. Um, in terms of women who had children during residency, it was one of the first, and we had actually pretty carefully timed it for chief year, because in chief year there's a lot more control over your schedule, and so you have sort of a lot more say in how the yearly schedule is constructed, but then, so like the rotation schedule, but then also in terms of the monthly schedule, in terms of like what days you need off. I had a really wonderful, supportive OB who basically just gave me her cell phone number and was like, okay, whenever you need to come, just come to clinic, just text me beforehand and just tell me you're coming and we'll fit you in somehow. So that was really easy. And so I like never missed never had trouble doing my scheduled prenatal appointments. So that was really nice. And and then after I had the baby, my mom had moved in with us, so she would take care of the baby during the day. I spent a lot of time coordinating pumping in the hospital. That was a major pain. So you'd be uh, like you'd be in a surgery, and then like you would obviously wait for the surgery to be over before you scrubbed out, and then you'd have to go pump. And the hospital at the time tried to be accommodating of the situation. So obviously like the hospital has like lactation facilities, but I would say that they weren't really designed for residents, or especially surgery residents, because for example, like they would have like 3 stations, right? And if you just happen to be there where the 3 stations were full, they just expect you to come back some other time. But when you're a surgery resident, like your time is not within your control, right? Like your next case is going to start like with or without you. So that part was a little bit challenging. And then like the location of the facilities was also challenging in terms of like, it would take you like 5 to 10 minutes just to even walk there. And then by the time you finish pumping and walk back, it would be like 30 or 40 minutes later. And you just don't have 30 or 40 minutes of time. So it ended up being like a lot of impromptu multitasking. Like I would be pumping, but like still writing my notes on a computer at the same time, or like calling people back, calling nurses back if they had questions about patients. And so it was kind of a really hectic time. Um, and but I also didn't feel alone, because at the time there was a transplant surgery fellow who had also had a baby at the same time. And then um, I also had a co-resident who also had a baby during that same period of time. So it actually worked out well that there were multiple people in the same situation because we could support each other and then also to advocate for each other.
Yeah, that must have been tough as a new mother, but also to have people around you in the same situation. That's great. And in general, I was wondering if you could, um, since you've had experience, talk about perhaps like the challenges of childbearing and childcare for your profession and specifically compared to perhaps women in other professions. You spoke a little bit about it, but perhaps could you elaborate on your view of this?
Yeah, so I would say that for both residents and even when you're an attending, like just the scheduling of childcare and taking care of a baby and pumping is really requires a tremendous amount of coordination and um, and there are some like really sort of like interesting modifications that people have made along the way. So, for example, um, so when you're breastfeeding, you usually have to either breastfeed or pump every 3 hours or so, 3 to 4 hours or so. And so that's really challenging, obviously, in the operating room if you're doing during a case, right? Like you either have to scrub out, pause your surgery and scrub out to pump. Um, so the surgeons that I know who have really long cases, there's actually newer pumps that fit under your clothes, and so you can actually like pump while you're doing your surgery, which to me at the time seemed a little bit unusual and uh, like I thought would be uncomfortable, but apparently people make that work. So that's kind of interesting. Um, you need what I like to describe as layers of childcare. And so you need to have daycare, you need to have neighbors or grandparents or friends that are willing to pick your children up if you're running late, which inevitably happens. So I would say that those are probably some of the challenges. I haven't really encountered the more emotional challenges of having a surgical practice yet with kids. So I've heard from my colleagues that sometimes they feel guilted by their children, that if their children don't see them for some period of time because they're coming home later after their children have already gone to bed. So I actually have been fortunate not to experience that to a huge degree. Although I will say that for a period of time, when you asked my daughter, like, oh, like, who are your favorite people, or like, who are your best friends? And so the sequence was daddy, and then it was Ama, which is my mother, and then it was Teddy, who's her teddy bear, and then Mama. So,
Wow. And so going back, could I ask how you came to specialize, um, or how did you come to focus on thyroid surgery in particular?
yeah. So remember that thing I said about instant gratification? And so endocrine surgery is sort of the epitome of that. So we deal with conditions that are highly curable. So over 90% of the patients we treat can be completely cured. And so whether that's Graves' disease or hyperparathyroidism or adrenal tumors, like we are really fixing the problem when we're removing that tumor or that diseased organ. And so that is really gratifying, and it is one of those things where you typically see the results pretty soon after surgery.
Yeah, that's great to see patients getting well with your efforts in the surgery room. Um, and lastly, for this section, what advice would you give to say, a pre-med student considering a career in the health industry or specifically on the surgical route?
Yeah, I would say that surgery is really satisfying, but it's not for everyone, and it's fine that it's not for everyone. Um, you definitely have to be willing to make some timing sacrifices in terms of sort of this very long training pathway. Um, but it's very nice that you are able to sort of meet people in this very scary part of their lives where they're needing an operation. And it's very nice to be able to be the person to guide them through that.
That's wonderful. Um, could you, for the records, say where you currently work and for how long?
Yeah, so I've been an endocrine surgeon at Methodist for 4 years. In the fall, I'm actually going to be transitioning my clinical practice over to Baylor College of Medicine. And then I'm also going to be starting my non-clinical role at Intuitive Surgery or Intuitive Surgical.
And how did you get introduced to Baylor College?
Well, I have had interactions with Baylor all the way since medical school. So I had visited them when I was looking at different medical schools and had really enjoyed the campus and meeting the people there. But I ultimately ended up at UC San Diego because it was an in-state school for me. And then when I came for residency, we had some interactions with Baylor faculty by virtue of being at Methodist. And then when I was attending at Methodist, I have several colleagues who work at Baylor in the endocrine surgery section. And so we had talked about working together in terms of research collaborations, and it just felt like when I took this job at Intuitive, it was a good time to scale down my clinical practice and move it over there.
Do you think it'll be a big change moving to Baylor on like how it affects your life or your lifestyle?
I don't think so. I hope it's not going to, in terms of sort of the day-to-day taking care of the patients. Where I'm hoping it's going to be a little bit different is that I'll have a lot more research collaborators. So that's what I anticipate.
That's great, and I wish you the best as well. I was wondering if you could speak about the challenges of entering the medical field as an Asian female and being younger than most. I was wondering, like, did you face any challenges? And if so, how did you overcome them?
I would say that it probably has less to do with being Asian because Asians are typically well represented in medicine. Being a woman is more challenging, especially in surgery, and some of those challenges I've already described to you. But there are what I would call a lot of microaggressions in surgery and probably some macroaggressions in surgery. So I will give you a specific example. Every once in a while, I will have a patient who I have explained the surgery to, and I've scheduled their surgery, and then I will show up on the morning of surgery, and they will be surprised that I'm there. Like, they will be surprised that I'm actually going to be the person that is performing their surgery, even though they came to my clinic and I explained the surgery to them and I scheduled their surgery. So that that kind of disconnect or microaggression happens not infrequently. And if you ask any of my female colleagues, everybody has a story like that to tell you. So I will also say that there are sometimes different expectations for how women surgeons behave versus how men surgeons behave. So you probably have heard that surgeons don't always have the most patient personality, right? Like everybody's heard of things like surgeons throwing things in the operating room. That doesn't really happen anymore, but you hear about that, right? And so there are definitely situations where you are in a high stress environment and you need a specific piece of equipment, right? And I think for men, it's fine to be demanding and precise, but for women, you somehow have to coach it in a very nice, non-threatening way, right? Because if you are precise and demanding, you are somehow being difficult. So I have a really good relationship with most of the nurses in the operating room, but even then, like every once in a while, I'll still get these comments like, you're really high maintenance, right? Like, and I think if I were a male surgeon, nobody would tell me that, because I definitely have partners that are higher maintenance than I am, and nobody ever says that to them.
Yeah, there is a kind of double standard in play with like the kind of attitudes between women and men that I could see that had happened. But I'm glad that so the staff at least didn't have um, that strong of like a kind of discrimination or prejudice about that. It's mainly, you said, with your patients.
Well, I think it's with both.
With
And
both.
it's things that people don't even realize, right? And
Yeah.
so it's sort of these inherent biases we have about how we expect certain people to behave.
Right. Um, and could you speak about some of your research interests? I saw, or you mentioned patient care and decision making, I believe. So what got you started and what are you currently working on?
Yeah, so my research interests really fall along two different tracks. So I am really interested in sort of the patient journey from in terms of the financial aspects. So a lot of my research has to deal with this question of value in surgery and measuring value from different perspectives, whether it's measuring it from the health system perspective, so from the hospital perspective, or from the insurer perspective, from the surgeon perspective, or from the patient perspective. And more of the recent work has been around what the patient perspective is. And so we done several projects looking at what the patient out-of-pocket costs are and what and this concept of financial toxicity, meaning that what patients have to pay out of pocket and how that impacts their quality of life or their stress levels about surgery. So those are things that we have been looking at recently. The other area that I'm really interested in is digital innovation in surgery, which is sort of why I took on this role at Intuitive Surgical. There are a lot of technological changes coming down the pipeline, both for surgery and just for the clinical workflow. And so at Methodist, over the past 2 years, we've spent a lot of time sort of digitizing the care pathway. And we spend a lot of time figuring out how we can engage patients in a way where we provide meaningful information in digestible pieces for patients. So one of the things that is really difficult about preparing a patient for surgery is that there's this huge volume of information that you want them to understand and all these steps that they have to do to get ready for surgery. And it's really impossible to convey that amount of information in a 30 or even 40-minute visit. And so, and even if you could tell them all that information, they're not going to retain it. And so we've really looked into ways where we can send smart alerts to patients at the time that they need that piece of information, that they can act on that piece of information both before and after surgery. And so that's sort of been the focus of my work over the past 2 years.
And your other responses include an effort to improve the quality of care for surgical patients across the country. What are some of the major challenges you've encountered or expect further down on the line in making care um, more accessible or caring for patients in the manner that you've described?
Um, So I would say that one is definitely this cost aspect. So some of our work has shown that there has been an increasing amount of cost shifting to the patients over time. So as the insurance companies start to um, demand more in terms of proving outcomes, the health systems are feeling that pressure, and as costs continue to go up, employers are feeling that pressure, and so they've shifted as more and more of the cost over to the patient. And so I think that's probably going to be an issue in the future, where really we are going to start pushing more patients um, into these difficult financial situations or even medical bankruptcy. So we could potentially cure your cancer, but then you're going to be bankrupt. And so that's really a challenging situation for someone to be in. The other things that have been focused on a lot nationally are sort of surgical never events, like things where really the processes of care, there should be processes in place that prevent certain things from happening. And those are increasingly being associated with financial penalties from both government payers and private payers. And so that's definitely a challenge in the upcoming years, because we obviously want to get there, but we need to figure out how to get there. So I would say that those are sort of the challenges that we face in the upcoming years.
And for a more, I guess, abstract or broad question, how do you define success for yourself, and has that changed over the years?
I think in surgery, it's really easy. In clinical surgery, it's easy to define success, right? Because your success is the patient getting back to their life. So that part is very satisfying and it's easy to see. Where it's a little bit harder is in academic surgery, where you have to do, in addition to your clinical practice, you also have to demonstrate scholarly activity. And for me, that part has been a little bit challenging, in that I have to balance that part with the rest of my responsibilities in terms of being a parent. And there has been a lot of research recently on why women do not get promoted in surgery, in academic surgery, up to the professor level, and why the pipeline is so leaky. And there have been multiple workarounds around that. For example, like many places allow you to extend the tenure clock if you're, or the promotion clock if you are, if you have children, right? Like for like every child you have, they like extend it by like a year. And so there are these workarounds. So for me, I think the most challenging part about being in academic surgery is not comparing yourself to your peers that are in totally different environments than you are, and have different resources that you do. And so being being able to work at your own rate and to be able to measure your own progress and to work on projects that are meaningful to you, I think is the meaning of success.
That's great. Um, and when was the last time you visited your family in China, your grandparents and your extended family, since your employment or even before then, or since you immigrated to the US? And have they visited you and your family here?
So my mom's mom did come for a period of time to visit. And I think that was when I was in either college or in medical school. Um, and then the last time I went back to China, it was the last time I went back to China was when my parents made me go back to China to get married a second time in China. So we had already gotten married. So we had already gotten married in the United States. And then they wanted to have like a ceremony in China too. And so that was the last time I was back in China.
Wow, that's really amazing. Could you describe the two weddings that you have then? And did your husband's family fly to China as well? Like what kind of celebration was it?
Yeah. So we got married in Napa, which is close to where my parents live in Northern California. And it was a very nice wedding. It was in wine country, and um, um, it, I guess, was very American in that sense. My parents did end up inviting several of their friends who I had actually never even met before. Um, so I feel like that's very Asian, but maybe that's not even an Asian thing. Maybe that's just a parent thing. When we got married in China, like 90% of the people I had never even met before. So it was definitely more of a thing for them than it was for us.
And could you describe more of perhaps going back, how did your husband meet your family first, and then how did you meet his family? And do your two families have a close relationship at all?
Um, so how I met his family, I think the first people I met in his family were actually his brother and his wife and their four kids. And then eventually, I think we ended up having lunch or dinner with his parents at some point, and then I was invited to like Thanksgiving and Christmas, and then so that's how I got to know his family. My parents, I think we went back to California one Christmas break, and that's how he met my parents. Um, and then you asked about whether our families interact a lot now. So my mom actually still lives with us. So like we just never let her move out after I had children, and then I had a second child, so she definitely could not leave. Um, but again, that question about like layers of childcare was so important. So there was a period of time my husband was doing consulting work, and so that basically meant that he was traveling Sunday through Thursday every week. And so he wasn't home during that period of time. And I just remember there was one time my mom got the flu, and except we didn't know that she had the flu. She felt really bad, and she told me she felt like she was having a heart attack. And so I had to take her to the emergency room, but then like I wasn't gonna like take my two kids to the emergency room with her at like 3 a.m. in the morning. So I actually had to call my father-in-law, and he actually came over in the middle of the night to take care of the kids while I took my mom to the ER. And so she ended up not having a heart attack. But she did have the flu, and her heart rate was 130, which made her feel like she was having a heart attack. Like stressed the importance of like having like many layers of childcare around you. And then shortly thereafter, I made my husband quit his job and find a job locally where he didn't have to travel Sunday through Thursday every week.
Yeah, it's nice to hear that that his family is relatively close by to you, where you lived. Um, and you mentioned that you have a second child. Could you say when he or she was born, and I guess during what period of your time he or she was born?
Yeah, so I had my second child at the end of right after I finished my endocrine surgery fellowship. And again, we had kind of timed it that way. And I would say that that is probably very common in for surgeons to try to actually time their kids to for periods of sort of these transitions or where you have more control over your schedule. So a lot of surgery residents, for example, have, if they're going to have kids, they're going to try to have kids during their personal development time or their research years, where the rotations, well, because you're not on a clinical rotation, your time is much more predictable. I will say that that is probably an additional challenge for women in medicine or women in surgery in particular, because your time in training is actually like your prime childbearing time also. And you kind of have this trade-off, right, where you're either inviting a lot of chaos into your life during your training by having a child, or you're going to try to delay having a child and then coming up against issues of fertility if you delay your childbearing. And so that's definitely a source of stress, I think, for many female residents that are in these long training programs. So I had my second child during at the end of fellowship, and I was really lucky in that I didn't have any fertility issues, and things pretty much happened according to schedule. And again, I was really lucky that my mom was there to support me and to help with the child care, which was really important for me as I sort of built up my clinical practice in the beginning and came to build this endocrine surgery program.
Great. Could you, speaking of your family life, could you perhaps speak about like what traditions or values your husband and his family brought over, and you brought as well? Since you did live with your grandmother, sorry, with your mother, did she keep up with the Chinese traditions and try to teach your children about them to keep your Chinese heritage alive?
Yeah, so I would say that now, kind of like when I was growing up, my grandmother did most of the cooking. So now my mom does most of the cooking. And so the vast majority of the time we're still eating Chinese food. Although the kids, they've actually branched out. So like they eat more typically Americanized kids food. So like they actually eat fish sticks and pizza, which I actually never ate when I was growing up. But they do eat some Chinese food as well. Like they definitely eat the tomato and eggs, and um, they also like eating roasted duck, like Peking duck, and so they definitely get plenty of exposure to both right now.
And what about from your husband's side? Did he have any traditions that he brought over?
Um, So my husband was born in the US, and so his family is Taiwanese. We do share some food traditions in terms of like also being into the fish balls. um, but other than that, I don't know that there are any like specific traditions or food traditions that we've implemented from his side.
Yeah, it's interesting to know his family's from Taiwan. Does he go visit them often? And have you visited Taiwan yourself?
Yeah, we've been to Taiwan together one time, and that was before our wedding to take Taiwanese wedding pictures. So that was definitely a cultural experience.
Oh wow, that's fun. What else did you do there during your trip there?
I actually had a bunch of friends from business school that were also in Taiwan at the time, just coincidentally. And so we spent a lot of time with them eating out at night markets.
Wow, that's great. And did you meet your husband's extended family there during that time? And
Yes.
yeah, so how was that like? And um, yeah.
I would say that most of the events revolved around eating. And so we just spent a lot of time either eating at home or going to restaurants.
Oh, there's a real love for food. That's great. And I think perhaps moving on to current events such as COVID, your paid time off, and more of your personal life. So to start off, how has COVID affected your medical practice and your personal life, like in the last year or so?
So the hospital did shut down elective surgeries for a period of time. It sort of delayed surgical care for some patients. I don't think it had a huge negative impact on the vast majority of patients because we did have or at least for my patients, because we did have exceptions where if we felt like delaying the patient's surgery was going to cause progression of the disease, that we could apply to do the surgery on a more urgent or emergent basis. The good news for endocrine surgery patients is that the vast majority of the conditions that we treat are really slow to progress. And so delaying the surgery by a couple of months generally does not make a huge difference in the ultimate outcome. Um, so from that perspective, it just maybe halted my practice for a short period of time, but I think long term did not affect the practice in any significant way.
And that's great to hear. In particular, has the pandemic influenced your telemedicine program and your efforts toward that, or your efforts toward patient care? Uh,
Oh, so yeah, so the telemedicine program definitely exploded during COVID. We had very sort of slow but steady uptake, like prior to COVID for telemedicine. So telemedicine has been in place in several departments at Methodist for several years prior to COVID, but the uptake had always been kind of slow and reluctant. And then when COVID happened, everybody was sort of forced onto telemedicine, but we're just fortunate in that the platforms and the protocols had already been established. So we could scale up really quickly, really fast, just really fast. And so that worked out really well. I will say that it also showed us what the limits of telemedicine were because after COVID sort of subsided, we saw a huge number of patients coming back into clinic. And there are definitely a subpopulation of patients when you offer them the option of doing a telemedicine visit versus coming in person. There are definitely some patients who will just say, no, I just want to come in person. I don't want to deal with installing an app.
that's that's fair. Also, the I guess a lot of patients feel more comfortable with that in-person interaction. Um, and from a healthcare worker's perspective, would you like to comment on the US's handling of the pandemic?
I would say that it kind of ebbs and flows, right? Like in the beginning, I felt like we were really not well prepared, like especially the public health systems had sort of been underfunded for many years. And so we really did not respond as fast as we could have. And then in terms of like supplies for PPE, we definitely were not prepared. And then when the vaccinations came through and then we finally started sort of ramping up the vaccinations, it seemed like we were doing really well for a while and we were going to totally just get COVID under control and things were going to go back to normal. But now it seems like we've kind of plateaued again and we might be actually backsliding a little bit. So I would say like it kind of ebbs and flows. Like some days I feel like we're doing really well and some days I feel like we could be doing a lot better.
Yeah, and going off of that, so most hospitals suffer from significant financial damage as a result of the pandemic. What have you personally observed in terms of the impact of this lack of support or turnover or loss of medical staff and other changes that you've seen faced by your particular field? And how has this impacted patient care? And what's your biggest concern at the moment?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people during this period of time, even before COVID, there was a lot of burnout for healthcare workers, and COVID really pushed people sort of to the breaking point. And I think we're seeing a lot of turnover and people leaving the medical field at this point, and I'm not sure that those people are going to come back. And I think that's going to create a lot of stress on healthcare systems because especially now as more people are seeking care that they were delaying during COVID, it's kind of creating this surge and there just aren't that many people around to be able to take care of as many people to take care of those patients. So that's definitely a major concern of mine.
Is there, what would you say would be a good way to like improve the situation if, or like what would be a good solution if there is one right now for the situation?
I think the hospitals that are and the practices that are going to do well during this time are going to have to really focus on retention efforts. And what that means is being able to give healthcare workers back some degree of autonomy, um, and also in terms of more support in terms of flexibility in the way that they schedule their shifts or that they construct their practices. I think those are probably the institutions that are going to be able to hang on to people, um, because I think there's going to be a major shortage of workers and only the places that really demonstrate that they have a commitment to your career progression or to your personal development are going to be able to hang on to people in the long term.
Right. And there's a good percentage of medical practitioners who choose not to be vaccinated in the medical center, as I've heard. With the uncertainty of the growing number of variants, how concerned are you by this, and what kind of efforts are in place to try to convince these practitioners to get vaccinated?
Yeah, so I am definitely concerned because the people who don't get vaccinated are creating sort of this selection pressure for more contagious variants. And in our stance at Methodist has been both the carrot and the stick, right? So like in the beginning, they basically offered anybody who was willing to get vaccinated a $500 bonus. And then at some point it became mandatory. And then if you didn't get vaccinated, you couldn't be employed at Methodist anymore. And I think that that actually has been the right stance for people in healthcare.
Yeah, do you know like if other hospitals are also taking that approach as well, and how the situation or looks in the US as a whole?
Yeah, I think more and more places are going to mandate that patients be, or that their workers be vaccinated. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Also, about another aspect of COVID or what has come up, um, there have been a rise of a lot of anti-Asian sentiments and hate crimes. So I was wondering if you or anyone you're close to has been victimized or has been targeted by these crimes, or any difficulties or discrimination that you had to face during this time.
I've been really fortunate in that that hasn't happened to me. I think it's probably a product of just not being out there that much this year, right? Like I mostly just go to the hospital and come back home. And my husband has been working from home like for a year and a half essentially. And so we really haven't had the opportunity to go out and interact much with other people other than like in for me in the hospital. And so I guess that's plus minus in that it hasn't given an opportunity for any of these negative interactions to happen.
And could you repeat what your husband's job was again? I think you did mention this before.
Yes, so he works in the tech industry.
Okay, I see. And you're currently on your PTO, correct? So how long it has it been, and what were the circumstances that that led you to decide to take a PTO at this time?
So PTO just means that I'm taking a few days off. So generally, I usually block a week or two off here and there for vacation. But this year we just didn't have anywhere to go, so I basically spent this time just at home catching up on paperwork.
Um, so what do you usually do on your vacations or times off? Do you usually travel with your family?
Yeah, so we used to go on basically a cruise every year. And last year we were actually scheduled to go on a cruise in March, and then COVID hit. So we obviously did not go, thankfully. Um, so, yeah, I actually don't know what our next trip is going to be or when it's safe to go on vacation again.
Are there any new hobbies or interests that you've picked up during this time with the during the pandemic and um, with maybe with your family? Do you spend more time with them?
Yeah, I've definitely picked up some crafting hobbies during this time. So I remember my kids, they had gotten a play kitchen, and we wanted to go and get some like play food, right? Like fruits and vegetables or like different things like that. And but they were actually like really hard to find online and also in the stores. So then we decided to just make some. And so we ended up like making a bunch of different like foods from felt and then stuffing them. And so we ended up making like an apple and like a pear and a lemon and a tomato. And then we decided, okay, well, we're going to make some Chinese food. So we made like an egg tart, and we made an egg roll, and we made some dumplings, and we made like a zongzi. And so that was a lot of fun for us.
Yeah, that sounds like a great way to bond with your children. um, and Also, is there anything that you did mention that you don't know when you'll be able to begin traveling again or going out. But is there a place that you have in mind that you would love to visit with your family, or like do you have like your next vacation location in mind?
Yeah, I would definitely like to be able to go back to Asia. I have this friend who has been engaged for about a year, and her wedding is going to be in Thailand, but they haven't been able to do it yet because, like, Thailand is pretty much closed to all tourism other than one island right now. And so ideally, whenever Thailand opens back up, we'll hopefully make it a family trip out there. And then in the more definite future, I guess, we've tentatively scheduled a cruise for December 2022. So hopefully that'll work out, but we'll see.
Yes, I hope so as well. And could you perhaps talk about any involvement with the Chinese American or just Asian American community in Houston? Um, and like, are you involved in any way with the community here?
I'm not formally involved in the community in any way. My father-in-law is more involved in the Taiwanese community more formally, but I'm personally not involved in any societies or groups.
All right. And I think I have just one last question for you. What is your view of the impact of COVID-19 on college graduates specifically who might have considered a career in the medical field, but because of the pandemic may maybe not so certain anymore? And do you have any advice for people who are thinking about going into the medical field?
Yeah, I think um, anybody who is considering entering the medical field probably recognizes that there is a degree of personal sacrifice that's required. And I would say that that, again, is not for everybody, but if you are realistic about what is required and the commitment that it takes, that it's a very satisfying career.
Great, and yeah, it's wonderful to hear that it has worked out for you. Um, and that's all the questions I have. Do you have any last thoughts that you would like to add? Anything that I didn't cover so far?
No, I just wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this interview.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me today.